Hey guys, tonight we dive into the curious case of a political scandal that shook Argentina in the 1950s. Imagine being in a country where the balance of power is precarious, where political loyalty is often tested, and where letters, simple pieces of paper, can change the course of history. Well, that's exactly what happened when a series of faked political letters started circulating, disrupting the fragile political landscape of Argentina. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I want to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop your location and the time there in the comments. I'll be curious to see where we're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was a time of intense political division in Argentina, the 1950s. President Juan Perón was at the height of his power, a leader adored by many for his populist policies, but despised by others for his authoritarian tactics. The country was split down the middle, with factions fiercely loyal to Perón and others eager to see his downfall. In the midst of this turbulence, something strange started to happen. Letters began circulating, letters that were allegedly written by high-ranking political figures. These letters would go on to shape the course of events in Argentina, but there was just one problem: they weren't real. At first, the letters seemed innocent enough. Public statements, political commentary, perhaps even private correspondence leaked to the media. But as the letters piled up, they began to reveal something much more insidious. Hidden within the neatly typed words were subtle messages, cleverly crafted to sway public opinion. They spoke of betrayal, dissent, and a looming threat to Perón's leadership. They didn't just shake the political scene, they set it on fire. It wasn't long before people began to question the authenticity of these letters. Were they truly written by the individuals they were attributed to? Or was someone orchestrating a much more elaborate scheme to manipulate the nation's fragile political state? It soon became clear that someone was using the power of the written word to spark a movement, one that would shake Argentina to its core. As the letters continued to flood the media, the nation found itself divided. The unrest was palpable. On one hand, Perón's loyalists rallied around their leader, dismissing the letters as nothing more than a ploy to undermine his rule. On the other hand, his critics began to seize on the messages within the forged documents, claiming they were evidence of a growing conspiracy against the president. These letters were no longer just words on paper. They had become symbols of political manipulation. But there was something more going on beneath the surface, something more than just a few carefully crafted pieces of correspondence. To understand the full weight of what was happening, you need to understand the political climate of Argentina in the 1950s. Juan Perón was no stranger to controversy. A former military officer, Perón had risen to power through a mix of populist policies and strong connections within the military and labor unions. His leadership, which focused on the welfare of the working class, earned him a substantial following among the poor, but it also earned him fierce enemies among the military and the upper class, who viewed him as a threat to their traditional power. As his power grew, so did his authoritarian tactics. He censored the press, restricted political opposition, and used state resources to maintain his control. It was a fragile balance, with much of the country teetering between support and dissent. The forged letters that started circulating were a response to this division. They were subtle, clever, and designed to do one thing: sow discord. They didn't directly attack Perón. Instead, they planted seeds of doubt, using coded language that implied betrayal within his ranks. The letters hinted at alliances, secret dealings, and betrayals from within Perón's own government. The idea was to shake the public's faith in their leader and turn his supporters against him. Imagine the impact. One moment, a person is reading a letter from a supposed ally of Perón, telling them of an insidious plot against the president. The next, they're wondering, was this person really on our side? The lines between truth and fiction blurred, and the consequences were nothing short of explosive. These letters were crafted with surgical precision. They didn't just disrupt the political scene, they manipulated it. And what's more curious is the fact that the letters themselves seemed to be backed by a strange, shadowy network. Who was behind it all? Who stood to gain from this carefully orchestrated scheme? As the letters continued to circulate, they became tools for political factions that wanted to bring down Perón. They were used as weapons in a larger fight for power, one that extended far beyond just the political elite. These letters weren't simply about Perón's downfall. They were about rewriting the rules of Argentina's political game. With each passing day, the political climate in Argentina became increasingly charged. The fake political letters were everywhere, printed in newspapers, discussed on the radio, and passed around in coffee shops. The country was buzzing with speculation, suspicion, and fear. What started as a few seemingly innocent documents had quickly grown into a full-fledged political scandal, one that questioned the very integrity of Argentina's political system. It wasn't just the public who was affected. The letters were starting to have a serious impact on the people at the heart of the political drama. Those mentioned in the letters, the political figures who were supposed to be allies of Perón, began to feel the heat. Allegations of betrayal and secret plotting had far-reaching consequences. Political careers were being destroyed, and the trust within Perón's inner circle began to unravel. The somber influence of deception, one of the most important things that set these letters apart from other political forgeries, was the subtlety with which they were designed. These were no crude hoaxes written hastily on scraps of paper. No, these letters were crafted by someone who understood the intricacies of Argentine politics and the way it could be manipulated. Each letter had a purpose: to pull the wool over the public's eyes, to distort the truth, and to create the illusion of a growing threat to Perón's rule. The words were carefully chosen, designed to be both believable and vague, to leave just enough room for interpretation. A letter from a supposed Perón confidant could imply that high-ranking officials were secretly plotting against the president, but it never outright accused anyone. It simply left a trail of breadcrumbs, pushing the reader toward a certain conclusion without ever directly stating it. This technique wasn't new. It had been used in political espionage for centuries. But what made this case so fascinating was how the letters appeared to be linked to a broader conspiracy. They weren't just random. They followed a pattern, each one building on the last. The goal was clear: to create enough doubt and confusion that it would eventually lead to a political breakdown. It was an art form, really. The forger, or forgers, had designed their plan with the precision of a surgeon. Every letter sent waves of suspicion through Perón's government, creating fractures within his own party. The more people began to question each other, the easier it was for the conspiracy to spread. But there was one question that remained unanswered. Who was behind the forgeries? And why? Was it a disgruntled member of the political elite trying to destabilize Perón's regime? Or was it a coordinated effort by his enemies to create chaos and shift the balance of power? What made this case so mysterious was that the forger's identity remained elusive. Some believed that it was a single individual, someone with deep knowledge of the inner workings of Argentina's political landscape. Others speculated that it was a group working behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the nation's political figures from the shadows. Regardless of who was responsible, one thing was certain. The political landscape of Argentina was changing, and the repercussions of the fake letters were beginning to spread like wildfire. As the letters continued to circulate and the political tension in Argentina grew, one thing became clear. The forgeries were having a tangible effect. What had initially been subtle hints of betrayal were quickly spiraling into full-scale paranoia. Perón's supporters were looking over their shoulders, wondering who they could trust. In the shadows, new alliances were forming, and old ones were crumbling. What had once been a well-oiled political machine now seemed on the verge of collapse, all thanks to a series of carefully worded letters. The letters weren't just attacking Perón, they were attacking the very foundation of his regime. And what was perhaps most alarming was the fact that no one knew who was behind the plot. The messages in the letters were not direct enough to identify a clear enemy. Instead, they were vague enough to make anyone a suspect. The forgeries didn't name names, but they planted seeds of doubt that grew into full-blown distrust. As the scandal deepened, the forgers' true power began to reveal itself. The letters had struck a chord with the public, and their impact was impossible to ignore. While some dismissed them as nothing more than an elaborate hoax, others took them as gospel. People began to question everything. Were their leaders secretly conspiring against them? Were the people they had trusted betraying them? And if so, who could they turn to for answers? It wasn't just the average citizens who were affected. In the halls of power, whispers of conspiracies grew louder. Political figures began to eye each other warily, wondering if their colleagues had a hand in the forgeries. Those who had once been part of Perón's inner circle found themselves isolated, cut off from the very people they had worked with for years. The political alliances that had kept the country running smoothly were now in tatters. And yet, through all this chaos, one question remained unanswered. Who was behind these letters? The forgers had managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities, using clever tactics to cover their tracks. The letters seemed to come from nowhere, appearing at just the right moment to stir up suspicion and unrest. But despite the widespread speculation, no one had been able to identify the mastermind behind the scandal. Some believed that the forgeries were the work of a disgruntled political figure, someone who had once been loyal to Perón but had turned against him. Others speculated that it was the work of a foreign power seeking to destabilize Argentina from within. But there were few concrete leads, and the authorities were struggling to keep up with the ever-growing web of deceit. In the meantime, the public continued to absorb the letters, each new one adding fuel to the fire of distrust. The country's political landscape was now a minefield, with each step potentially triggering an explosion. Perón's enemies, both within and outside of his government, saw this as their chance to strike. The letters had created a perfect storm, and everyone seemed to be scrambling to position themselves in the chaos. As the weeks went by, the situation became more volatile. The letters, once seen as a fringe concern, had now become the centerpiece of the political debate. Citizens were debating in the streets, in cafes, and on the radio. Political figures were issuing statements, trying to distance themselves from the growing scandal. But no matter how hard they tried, the damage had already been done. The somber consequences of deception at the heart of all this. The forgers continued to watch from the shadows, pulling strings and carefully orchestrating the chaos they had created. But despite their success in causing disruption, there was something strange about the situation. Why had they gone to such lengths to manipulate the political system? What was the ultimate goal? Was this just an elaborate game, or was there a deeper agenda at play? The letters, after all, didn't just create political chaos. They also pointed to deeper divisions in the country. Argentina, like many countries, was a nation divided. The rich and powerful wanted to maintain their control, while the working class, many of whom supported Perón, wanted to see real change. The forged letters had amplified these divisions, causing them to flare up and spill out into the open. But who stood to gain from such a fractured nation? Perhaps the most unnerving part of all this was how the forgeries seemed to act like a mirror, reflecting the divisions within Argentine society. The letters didn't create the distrust, they exposed it. They revealed the cracks in the political system that had been there all along, but had been hidden behind a veneer of unity. As the days stretched on, the letters continued to arrive, each one adding to the political turmoil. But just as the forgeries were beginning to feel like a permanent part of the political landscape, something unexpected happened. The forgers disappeared. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only their words and the chaos they had caused. No one knew why the forgeries stopped or who had pulled the strings behind them. Some believed that the perpetrators had achieved their goal and simply walked away, leaving the country to sort through the wreckage. Others thought that the forgers had been caught, their identities finally revealed in a dramatic expose. But the truth remained elusive. In the aftermath, the country was left to pick up the pieces. Perón's supporters and enemies both claimed victory, each side seeing the situation through their own lens. Some argued that the letters had been part of a larger conspiracy to bring down Perón's regime, while others saw them as a reflection of the deep-rooted divisions in the country that had been there all along. The strange disappearance of the forgers left an unsettling silence in the wake of the chaos. Though the letters had stopped, the damage had been done. The public's faith in their leaders was shattered, the political landscape irrevocably altered. But the most curious thing was the lingering question: who were the forgers? The authorities had conducted countless investigations into the origins of the letters, but no one could figure out who was behind the scandal. There were plenty of theories. Some believed it was a faction of military officers seeking to destabilize Perón's government, while others thought it was an act of sabotage by Perón's political rivals. Even whispers of foreign influence began to creep into the conversation, with some suggesting that international powers had planted the letters as part of a larger game of political chess. Despite these numerous theories, no one could connect the dots. The forgers remained elusive, their identities carefully hidden beneath layers of false leads and circumstantial evidence. Perhaps that was the true power behind the letters. Whoever had masterminded the forgeries knew how to cover their tracks, how to remain in the shadows, and how to make their manipulation feel like a natural consequence of Argentina's political unrest. But while the authorities struggled to unearth the truth, something else was brewing beneath the surface. The letters, though fake, had ignited a firestorm of political conversation, and the public was hungry for answers. Politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens all began to question everything they had once taken for granted. The very fabric of Argentina's political system was unraveling, and no one could predict where it would end. A new kind of power in the wake of the scandal, a strange kind of power emerged. It wasn't power derived from political office or military might, but power in the form of public opinion. For the first time, it felt like the citizens of Argentina were taking control of the narrative. The letters, in all their deceit, had opened the door for ordinary people to become political players. Conversations that once took place behind closed doors were now happening in cafes, on street corners, and over the radio waves. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a theory, and most importantly, everyone had a voice. The country was no longer divided just between political factions. It was divided between those who believed in the authenticity of the letters and those who dismissed them as the work of a few troublemakers. But even those who didn't believe in the letters couldn't deny the effect they had on the nation. The letters had become symbols, not just of political infighting, but of the power of words, of the influence that could be wielded with a carefully crafted statement. Some might say that the forgers had accomplished exactly what they set out to do: create chaos, stir the pot, and challenge the status quo. In doing so, they had shown just how fragile political power truly was. In a country like Argentina, where loyalty and authority were often based on personal connections and public perception, the very act of questioning the integrity of the political elite was enough to unravel years of carefully constructed order. It wasn't just the politicians who were affected, it was everyone. The letters had cut through the facades of power and exposed the cracks beneath. The forgers, whoever they were, had reminded the people of Argentina that ultimately it was their perception that shaped the political reality. But despite this new form of power emerging, the somber reality of consequences was ever present. The letters had not only disrupted the political system, but they had also shattered the trust between leaders and the people they served. How could anyone trust the words of a politician after the letters had spread so much doubt? In the wake of the scandal, those who had been implicated by the letters were forced to either defend themselves or fall into obscurity. Some politicians took to the airwaves to deny the accusations, while others went into hiding, hoping the scandal would eventually fade. But for the public, the scandal was far from over. The question on everyone's lips was simple: who was behind the letters? The forgers, by disappearing so quickly and effectively, had left the country with no clear answers, no resolution. It was a brilliant tactic, if you thought about it. They had not only exposed the vulnerability of the political elite, but had also left behind a nation that was politically fragmented, uncertain, and searching for a scapegoat. No one truly knew if the letters had been part of a larger conspiracy, or just the work of a few disillusioned individuals seeking to make a point. But in many ways, the lack of answers was the most damning thing of all. It left the nation unsettled, wondering if their entire political system was built on lies and deceit, ready to collapse under the slightest pressure. The somber impact on history, and what about history? What would history say about the faked political letters? Would they become just another footnote in Argentina's turbulent political history? Or would they be remembered as the moment that everything began to change? As time passed, the letters would fade from the headlines, but the political divide they had created would remain. It was impossible to go back to the way things had been before. Some might argue that the letters had done the country a service. They had forced the people of Argentina to face the uncomfortable truth. Their leaders, the ones they had trusted to govern, were not always what they seemed. The letters may have been fake, but the doubts they stirred were all too real. For Perón's government, the fallout was profound. The letters had struck a blow to his credibility, and though he would remain in power for a time, the scars of the scandal would never fully heal. His opponents would use the letters as ammunition against him, and the country would be left to reckon with the consequences of a divided political system. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the faked political letters was the shift in public perception. They showed just how fragile political power could be, and how easily it could be manipulated with the right words. In the end, the letters weren't just a crime. They were a lesson in the power of narrative and how it could shape the future of a nation. As the weeks passed, the fervor surrounding the fake political letters began to subside, but the aftermath remained. Argentina had been shaken, and while the headlines no longer screamed about the forgeries, The scars left by the scandal were visible everywhere, on the streets, in the air, and in the hearts of the citizens. For many, the letters had been a wake-up call. They had shown just how easily truth could be manipulated and how fragile trust really was in a political system that relied so heavily on perception. But for others, the forgeries simply added fuel to the fire of their existing discontent. Argentina's political divisions were not new. They had been there for years, simmering under the surface. The letters, in some strange way, had brought them into the open, forcing people to confront the truth about their leaders and about themselves. The public's trust in politicians was irrevocably shaken. Whether or not the forgeries were the product of a larger conspiracy or the work of a small group with an axe to grind, one thing became abundantly clear. The political elite was not above reproach. If a few well-placed words could cause such chaos, what else had been hidden from the public? But perhaps what was most interesting about the scandal was not the immediate fallout, but the long-term effects it had on the way politics were viewed in Argentina. After the letters, people began to question everything. Politicians, media outlets, and even ordinary citizens became more skeptical of the official narrative. The world they once trusted, the institutions they had been taught to rely on, were now seen through a different lens. The faked letters had opened their eyes to the fact that things weren't always as they seemed. The somber effects of uncertainty in the months following the scandal, there was an almost tangible unease in the air. It wasn't just about the letters anymore. It was about what they represented. The uncertainty that came with them had seeped into the fabric of Argentine society. People began to look at each other differently. Was this person really on your side? Was that politician truly trustworthy? The paranoia that the letters had fueled lingered, casting a shadow over any political conversation. And yet, despite all of the drama, despite the endless speculation about who was behind the forgeries and the political ramifications that followed, the true architect of the letters was never found. The authorities could only trace a few leads, and each one either led to a dead end or turned out to be another false lead. In the end, it didn't matter who was behind the letters. The fact that they had caused such a ripple through the nation was enough. The forgers had made their point, not by taking power, but by exposing the frailty of it. For those in Perón's inner circle, the damage was immense. Many found themselves struggling to restore their credibility, and some of his staunchest supporters quietly distanced themselves from him. The president, despite his popularity with the working class, had lost a measure of his once untouchable power. It was as if a crack had been exposed in his carefully constructed facade, and although the public still looked to him as a leader, the trust they had once placed in him was no longer as strong. But the scandal didn't just affect Perón's government, it affected everyone. The forged letters had sown seeds of doubt everywhere. In the cafes, on street corners, and in the crowded markets of Buenos Aires, people spoke of the letters as if they were part of the very air they breathed. And while some dismissed them as nothing more than the work of a few radicals, others began to see them as a symbol of a much larger truth. That power, once seemingly secure, could be toppled with a few well-placed words. In many ways, the faked letters were a reflection of the times. Argentina in the 1950s was a country teetering between two forces. On one side, a populist government that had brought a degree of prosperity to the working class, and on the other, a conservative elite determined to preserve their power. The letters, though fake, had revealed the cracks in the system. They had shown how fragile the balance of power truly was. As the years went on, the scandal of the faked political letters faded from the headlines. But it remained in the collective memory of the country, a cautionary tale about the power of words and the fragile nature of political trust. The lessons learned during that time would linger long after the letters themselves had been forgotten. A final whisper, what is perhaps most striking about the whole affair is that, even now, no one really knows who was behind the letters. Theories abound, from high-ranking political officials to disgruntled citizens. Some believe that the letters were the work of those who had once been close to Perón and were now attempting to sabotage his regime from within. Others believe that foreign agents may have been involved, using the forgeries to destabilize Argentina from the outside. But in the end, the question of who was behind the letters has never been definitively answered. And maybe that's the true mystery of the whole affair. Perhaps it doesn't matter who was behind the letters. What matters is the impact they had on Argentina, the way they exposed the fragility of political power, and the way they reminded the people of the true cost of trust. The forgeries had shown the world that political systems, no matter how strong they appear, can always be shaken by a few well-placed words. As you think back on the events that unfolded, you might wonder what would have happened if those letters had never been written. Would Argentina have gone on with its political divisions, quietly simmering under the surface? Or did the forgers, in their shadowy game, play a much larger part in the country's history than anyone could have anticipated? Whatever the case may be, the legacy of the faked political letters is clear. They changed the way the people of Argentina saw their leaders, their government, and each other. The trust that had once been implicit in Argentina's political system was now forever compromised, and the impact of that would last for generations. Despite the fading headlines, the effects of the fake political letters continued to linger in Argentina. It wasn't just the politicians who had been shaken. It was the very fabric of Argentine society that had been touched. The letters had disrupted not only the political elite, but also the trust the public had in their institutions. It had all started with a few words written in ink on a piece of paper, and yet the echoes of those words would be felt for years. In the aftermath, the power of words was clearer than ever. The forgers had exposed how easily the political machine could be thrown into disarray. They had tapped into something much deeper than just political rivalry. They had touched on a shared anxiety, a collective doubt that had been building in the country for some time. In doing so, they had shown the vulnerability of power, and that vulnerability, once exposed, was hard to ignore. The somber truth was that Perón's government, though resilient, would never quite be the same. His support base, though still large, had been fractured by the scandal. The letters had forced many people to reconsider their loyalty, not just to him, but to the very system he had built. The once ironclad trust in political figures had been broken, and with that break came a shift in the way the public viewed their leaders. The faked letters had made it clear. No one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the consequences of manipulation. Even more telling was the way the country responded. The political debate was no longer confined to closed rooms or behind closed doors. It had moved to the streets, to public squares, to cafes and taverns. The letters had ignited a firestorm of discussion. People who had never cared for politics were suddenly invested in it. The lines between the elite and the common folk were blurred, as both sides debated the authenticity of the letters and the credibility of their leaders. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion carried weight. At the same time, the mystery of who had written the letters remained unsolved, and this only added to the intrigue. The uncertainty created by the letters did not simply fade away. It evolved into a new kind of political atmosphere, one where conspiracy theories thrived and truth was always in question. Politicians tried to dismiss the forgeries as the work of a small, fringe group, but the public wasn't so easily convinced. Even though the letters had stopped appearing, the doubt they had planted continued to grow, like an infection in the body of the nation. The power of uncertainty for years after the letters, the shadow they cast over Argentine politics would not lift. In fact, their legacy would have a lasting influence on future generations of politicians and citizens alike. The lesson was clear. Power, whether it's political or personal, could be undermined by words, and the public's trust could be so easily manipulated. In the years following the scandal, Argentina's political system would undergo changes, but the seeds of doubt sown by the forgeries never quite disappeared. Politicians learned to be more careful with their words, more mindful of the public perception. They understood that, in the end, the people were the ones who held the power, and once the public's faith was shaken, it was a long, difficult road to restore it. The letters, though fake, had exposed the raw reality of political power. They had reminded the country of something it would rather not face. That politics is never as clean as it seems, that behind every decision, there are people with their own agendas, their own desires. Whether in Argentina or elsewhere, the forger's message had been clear. The questions still lingered, even if the answers were few. Who had orchestrated the forgeries? What had they hoped to achieve? Had it been just a game, or was there something more to the scandal? And perhaps most importantly, had anything truly changed in the political fabric of Argentina? For the sommelier, who had watched this unfold from the sidelines, the faked political letters represented everything he had come to understand about the fragility of power. They had shown him that no matter how secure one might feel in a position of influence, the winds of change could sweep through unexpectedly, leaving destruction in their wake. His own experiences in the world of manipulation and deception had taught him similar lessons. He knew firsthand how easy it was to twist public perception, to play with people's emotions, and to make them believe something that wasn't true. For the people of Argentina, the aftermath of the letters was a somber reflection on their own vulnerability. The forgers had succeeded in shaking the political system, but they had also awakened the nation to the fact that they could never fully trust the powers that be again. The political landscape would never be the same, and the suspicion created by the faked letters would linger in the minds of citizens long after the scandal had faded from the front pages. The quiet aftermath years later, when historians look back at the case of the faked political letters, they would refer to it as a defining moment in Argentine political history. But the true impact of the forgeries couldn't be measured in terms of political power alone. The real significance was in the shift in the public consciousness, in the awareness that no one was invincible, no one was above reproach. Even the most powerful leaders could be brought down by the power of words, and in this case, those words were forged with a careful, deliberate hand. As the years passed, the mystery of the forger's identity faded into obscurity. Speculations continued, of course, but no one could ever prove who was behind it all. Perhaps that was the most brilliant part of the entire scheme. The fact that the forgers had left no trace, no mark that could be definitively tied back to them. They had disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only their words and the chaos they had caused. And so Argentina moved on. New leaders rose, and the country continued to evolve. But the lessons of the faked letters, of the power of words and the fragility of political trust, would remain ingrained in the national consciousness. Every new political scandal, every new debate, carried with it the shadow of those long-ago letters. The forgers may have disappeared, but their legacy lived on. As time passed, the faked political letters became something of a legend in Argentine political circles. They were discussed in hushed tones, referenced as an example of the volatile power of words in shaping public opinion. But the story didn't end with the disappearance of the forgers. Instead, the scandal had left behind a lingering aftertaste, one that would shape not only Argentine politics, but also the global understanding of how easily trust could be eroded by subtle manipulation. Political leaders around the world, not just in Argentina, began to take a much harder look at how information could be twisted to serve agendas. They studied the forgeries as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how an unseen hand could disrupt even the most carefully constructed systems. The lessons learned from the forgeries were slowly woven into the fabric of political strategy. But the most fascinating aspect of the whole affair was the way the letters remained, almost like an invisible thread connecting the past to the present. They hadn't just been part of an isolated scandal. They had become a symbol, a warning that governments could no longer rely on the loyalty of the masses alone. Now, political discourse had become a battlefield where perceptions mattered just as much, if not more, than facts. The political game changes. Forever the somber reality of the aftermath settled over Argentina's political system like a fog. Political careers were ruined, but some of the most profound shifts came not from those who lost their positions, but from those who took note of what had happened. A new generation of politicians arose, ones who were far more aware of the dangers of public perception and who understood how fragile trust could be. For the sommelier, watching from the sidelines of political life, the lessons were clear. Just as he had learned in his own dealings, whether in smuggling, forging, or manipulating situations, the key to power wasn't just in controlling the visible structures of society. It was in understanding how to control perception, how to direct people's attention, and how to subtly influence their beliefs. And while the public in Argentina was left with only questions about the forgers' identities, the true impact of the letters wasn't about finding out who was responsible. It was about recognizing how easily public opinion could be swayed. With the right tools, any narrative could be shaped to fit a purpose. And that reality would never be the same again. Restoring trust? In the years that followed, efforts to restore the public's trust in the government and the political system seemed like an uphill battle. Perón's regime did remain intact for a time, but even he couldn't ignore the undercurrents of mistrust that now flowed beneath the surface of Argentine politics. The forgeries had opened a Pandora's box, and there was no closing it. In truth, trust had become a commodity. Politicians now had to earn it daily, constantly proving their loyalty to the people, and even then it was fragile. Public figures who once enjoyed a long-standing reputation now found themselves scrutinized with a more critical eye. The letters had changed the way people viewed their leaders, no longer as figures of absolute authority, but as individuals who could be just as easily manipulated as the public they ruled. The once dependable institutions that had kept Argentina running were now being questioned. Was everything built on lies? Was the political system as corrupt as it seemed? The fake letters, though never fully acknowledged as the orchestrated scheme they were, had exposed just how vulnerable the structure of power could be. And for the first time in Argentina's history, the public began to demand more transparency, more accountability, and above all, more honesty from their leaders. The quiet ripple effect, though the immediate scandal surrounding the letters eventually faded, their ripple effect continued for years. It wasn't just a matter of political disruption. It had altered the very nature of public engagement. The Argentine public, once passive, now became more active, more involved, and more vigilant. Citizens began to question the narratives put forth by politicians and the media, no longer simply accepting things at face value. In many ways, this shift reflected a broader change that would sweep across the globe in the decades that followed. The rise of the internet, the explosion of social media, and the spread of misinformation would only amplify the lessons learned from the fake letters. The manipulation of public opinion, once relegated to the backrooms of political offices, would soon find its home in the hands of ordinary people, and those who could control it would wield tremendous power. The sommelier, watching these developments from afar, couldn't help but see the parallels to his own life. He had spent years perfecting the art of deception, of using subtle influence to manipulate the course of events. But in the end, he realized that he had been playing a game that was already shifting beneath his feet. The world was changing, and the rules of the game were being rewritten in real time. And though he may have escaped one form of manipulation, he couldn't escape the larger forces at play in the world. The end of an era eventually, the scandal surrounding the forged letters faded into history, becoming just another chapter in the tumultuous political saga of Argentina. But the lessons it taught remained. The importance of trust, the fragility of public opinion, and the power of words. All of these things would stay with Argentina and the world for years to come. The forgers, whoever they were, had managed to do what many thought impossible. They had shaken the foundations of power and left an indelible mark on history. The power of their manipulation had been simple, yet devastating. And as the years passed, those who studied the event could only marvel at how such a small act, a few letters, could shift the course of a nation's history. The sommelier, now far removed from the political chaos of Argentina, found himself pondering the legacy of the letters. They had exposed the hidden vulnerabilities of power, the delicate threads that held together a country's political system. And though the forgers had vanished into the night, their influence remained, lingering in the air like a faint whisper. For now, Argentina had moved on. But the lessons of the faked political letters were far from forgotten. They would be remembered, not just in Argentina, but in every corner of the world where power, perception, and manipulation intersected.